Kristalina Georgieva is the new managing director of the International Monetary Fund. The Bulgarian is the first economist from a developing country to head the 189-nation fund. She's replaced Christine Lagarde, who will now head the European Central Bank. Previously, Georgieva served as the CEO of the World Bank and as the EU's budget chief. She's stepping in as global growth falters, trade tensions persist, and debt rises.
Warning signs are flashing, and we must be ready to be tested.
Last year, the IMF gave Argentina a $57 billion bailout package, its biggest ever. And more countries are expected to need support in coming months.
My immediate priority for the IMF is to help members minimize the risk of crisis and be ready to cope with downturns should they occur.
The IMF is a $1 trillion fund, but it's losing some support from its largest member, the US. So the international lender could itself face a crunch.
And our senior business producer, Mobin Nasir, joins us on set for more on this. Hi, Mobin. Now, in her first address as the new IMF boss, Georgieva said, warning signs are flashing over the global economy. What are these signs?
Well, clearly the biggest concern is economic growth. It's slowing, and it's slowing across developed and emerging economies. And we're seeing investments falling, we're seeing global trade falling, and what's perhaps most worrisome within the trade context is that the demand for not consumer goods, rather it's industrial goods that are seeing a fall in demand. So you can expect companies are in this slower for longer sort of situation. And we've seen across developed economies that lower interest rates are not driving growth as they did in previous economic cycles.
And we know the IMF has a very checkered past. It's still a controversial institution today. But which countries do we expect to be in need of their assistance over the next few months and the year, I guess?
Well, if we know about the case for Argentina, they negotiated a $57 billion bailout program. And as recently as Tuesday, they had talks for a $5 billion tranche, which stalled. Those weren't approved as yet. And it looks that that program might be in trouble because President Mauricio Macri himself seems to be on the way out. His opponents seem to be gaining ground on him. And then, of course, you have Portugal, Greece, Ukraine, Pakistan, Ireland. These are the other sort of big borrowers, together making up about $75 billion in borrowing. And none of these economies is out of the woods yet. They are all expected to be in need of IMF funding over at least the next 2 to 3 years. And then you have a bunch of about 30 odd more that are also in IMF programs. So clearly a lot of countries out in need of money from the IMF still.
Now, Georgieva is also the first IMF chief to come from an emerging economy. She grew up in communist Bulgaria, an economy that still is quite reeling from that past, I guess. But why is that significant?
Well, I wonder if it really is. You know, it makes a great headline that she was born in a communist country, but really from the time that she was a British Council scholar to the years she spent at the World Bank, rising all the way to the top, and also as the EU's budget chief, when we talk about the bureaucracy forcing countries like Greece, like Spain, cut spending on their social sector, raise taxes, and make sure that they pay off their lenders first, I mean, that's exactly what the job description is for the EU's budget chief. So really, you know, one can expect the same formula of requiring higher interest rates, higher taxes, cutting spending, and basically prioritizing borrowers, or rather lenders, over the population.
Okay, and we know that Donald Trump recently at the General Assembly attacked globalism, which includes multilateral institutions like the IMF. Now, the US has threatened to cut funding from the IMF. Will that affect the way it operates?
I think for now, it seems like that's a threat. We are yet to see if the US will go through it. Look, the way the IMF functions, it's not one country, one vote, right? It's based on the size of the economy. And given that, the US is pretty much still the most influential player in the IMF, and really that seems very unlikely to change. In fact, perhaps what the president was hinting at, we've seen that the Trump administration is quite eager to use its financial muscle in its diplomacy. And so we could see countries like Pakistan, which a couple of years ago was really not looking like it would get that support from the IMF simply because its ties with Washington were not at their best, and they've had some sort of a reset. You know, we've seen the Pakistani Prime Minister now make his third trip to the US. So really, I think what we can expect is that the US will very likely remain very influential, but there might be a lot more sort of strings attached to the funding that is to go to many of these borrowing countries.
Okay, let's see how she carries on in her first term as IMF chief. Mobin, thank you as always.